Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, with the polls narrowly favouring Leave and the bookies tightening the odds, earlier I sat down with the Prime Minister, David Cameron, who's been campaigning here in Cardiff to remain in Europe. Prime Minister, do you really think that if we vote to leave, we risk war, economic damage, permanent damage to our welfare?
Well, let's take each one of those in turn. First of all, I never said that we would face World War III. I just simply said Europe has played a role in bringing the countries of Europe together after a century of two appalling conflicts. And while we should credit NATO, we should also credit the European Union.
But
and
you
I
didn't
asked
say
the question.
war. You didn't say
I
war.
didn't actually. I said, can we really take for granted that the security of our continent is guaranteed? And I don't think we can. So I think that's a perfectly realistic thing to say. As for the economic warnings, they're not just made by me, they're made by the IMF, the OECD, organisations that are paid to advise prime ministers and countries about economic risks.
But then why on earth did you risk this? I mean, if you knew that this was the risk to Britain, what on earth were you doing calling a referendum that risked the possibility this might happen?
Well, because I think it's right for the people to decide about how the country is governed and the arrangements under which we live with the European Union and the rest of it. We haven't had a vote since 1975, and I think we've had a lot of European treaties and changes since then, and referendums frankly have been promised and not delivered, and I think it was time to say, right, let's put this beyond doubt, let's have a renegotiation, which I think was delivered successfully. We made some important changes, and now let's ask the people. I'm confident we'll get the right result, which is Britain staying in a reformed European Union. But, you know, the people are sovereign, not the politicians, and it's right to have this discussion and decision.
It's a very nice explanation, but with respect, the people were not crying out for a referendum. The people who were crying out were people in your own party.
Well, I don't really accept that, actually. All political parties were discussing and having pressures for referendums. It actually was popular in all parties and actually in all parts of the country.
Let's be candid, both you and Boris could have been outers. You could have been people for Leave.
I've actually, in my political life, I've always argued for reform. I've never wanted us to join the Eurozone. I've always wanted Europe to change and for things to get done to make it more flexible. But I've never actually argued for out in my political lifetime. I've never argued for out.
No, but that's all lots of nevers. But you've never actually talked about the promised land in Europe. You don't have a passion for Europe. You've never expressed a passion. And that's in a sense why this competition, this campaign is in trouble.
I don't accept that. I'm not a utopian dreamer. I believe in the United Kingdom and in Britain and in our future, but I think we are better off, safer and stronger as part of a European Union. But my arguments, I accept. I'm a practical person. My arguments are mostly practical, about the strength of our economy, about the safety of our people, about the strength of our country. I think there are bits of idealism within me. I think that you know, when I look at the fact that we sit around this table and talk with each other and Europe has found a way to avoid conflict, that does make me proud. And
that's jolly difficult in the face of Albion and people talking about the old days, the good old days when Britain was great. We want to put the great back into Britain. And all you're saying is, well, I think we'd be a bit better in Europe. It's a bit safer.
I think I'm making a stronger argument than that. As I was saying today, you know, I think, you know, Churchill stood alone in May 1940 and decided to fight on, but he didn't want to be alone. He wanted to be fighting with others in Europe. He was standing up for European democracy and freedom and the rule of law, and I think we should stand up for that again today.
For you, it's do or die, isn't it? Have you got the fire you talked about just a year ago after the election?
I think you've seen from me a very passionate and strong pro-Remain campaign. I've been to every part of the United Kingdom. I've stood on platforms with politicians of different parties. I've made economic arguments. I've made, I think, very strong arguments about Britain's place in the world. I think I've put everything I can into this campaign, and there's another 7 days to go after this one, and you'll see even more.
But if you look at what the issue now involves, it basically involves immigration and people who have jobs at stake, people who are worried about educational standards, people who are worried about the health service. They're worried about immigration, and you don't connect with them.
Well, I think immigration is a challenge, but I think everybody understands that you don't solve an immigration problem by wrecking your economy, which is what I think we do.
But it's not a challenge to your house, to your job. They feel
individually challenged by immigration?
I think it is a challenge for everybody because of the pressure and because of the rate of change. And my argument is, look, there are good ways to control immigration. We need to do more to control it from outside the EU, which is, remember, more than half of the total net migration. And inside the EU, through my negotiations, securing this change so that people, they can come, but if they can't get a job and they can't support themselves, they have to go. And if they do stay, they have to work for 4 years paying in before they get full access to the welfare system. I think that's a change that has huge support in our country. It hasn't come in yet, but if we stay, it will, and it'll make a difference.
Do you think that what Boris Johnson and what Michael Gove have been saying has been true? Have they spoken the truth?
I'm going to focus, as I've said, on the issues and the facts and the figures and the arguments. Some of the claims made by the Leave campaign, I think, are completely untrue. The idea that Turkey's about to join the European Union is not true. For instance, the idea that we, 350 million a week is the cost of our membership, that is not true. And it's been important to nail these things during the campaign, and I think by and large we are doing that.
Can you imagine what that does to people looking in and wondering about their future government in this country? After all, technically, you've got 4 years to run. The idea that you're going to be working together with people that have accused you of lying, told lies according to you, spoken untruths, people who can't be trusted. Some of your very own ministers have said you can't be trusted.
Well, it's a passionate campaign, and that is inevitable when you've got such an enormous issue and such deep differences of opinion about whether Britain is better off remaining or Britain's better off cutting itself off.
But you're not going to
Europe.
pretend that in the future suddenly all these things will be buried. Once you've had a referendum, it'll all be over, and we'll all be friends and toiling together in the interests of Britain.
That
it doesn't stack up.
Well, I don't agree with that. We all supported a referendum. We'll accept the judgment of the British people, and we'll have to come back together again afterwards. And there's a huge government programme of life chances, reforming prisons, reforming schools, investing in childcare, creating a 7-day NHS. There's huge challenges to overcome. And I think you'll be surprised how politicians can have an argument, have that decided, and then get on with the other things about which they, by and large, agree.
Can I just ask you then about election expenses, which is something that we've worked out very extensively. Why have you been prepared to spend money on a QC to try and stop police investigating what we have revealed?
Well, we haven't been doing that. What we're doing is we are cooperating with the...
You had a QC in the Thanet South constituency, in the court, actually asking the judge to stop the investigation.
Well, there's a year-long process of investigating these things.
But you didn't want that year. You went to court to ask the court not to allow the police an extension to go on investigating these abuses.
That's right. As I said, there had been a year, and it's perfectly legitimate to argue, well, that's enough time to look at it. But look, I'm very happy for the Electoral Commission to examine all of this.
Well, why get a QC to stop it then?
Well, that was in one particular seat. But I'm very happy that they've got the time now and they've got all the paperwork to examine this. But I do
Well,
think...
they have got the paperwork, but Prime Minister, with respect, the Electoral Commission had to go to court to wring the papers out of you.
They didn't have to go to court.
They did.
They didn't.
They did.
That's not right.
You were 3 days overdue and they had to go to court.
We had told them when the papers were going to be delivered. And so in our view, that was unnecessary.
That is not their view.
Well, that is not my view.
Will you, as Prime Minister, move this thing speedily through so that it can be resolved as quickly as possible? Because at the moment, your own majority, if any of this is proved, is in serious danger.
Well, what we're doing is answering the questions of the Electoral Commission. As I say, I think, look, it's a Channel 4 investigation, and I know you're proud of the work that you've done. We're very happy. We're answering all the questions. I think you're making quite a large mountain out of what I think is a relatively
So you disagree with the judge, then?
No. I think it's a relatively straightforward set of questions that we have to answer. I'm very confident we're going to answer all of them and put this issue comfortably away.
Final word on the referendum. Are you going to win?
I very much hope so. I believe so. I think we have the strongest arguments, and I think the more that people consider the future of our economy, the jobs, the livelihoods, the advantages we get out of being part of a single market of 500 million people, that we're better off if we stay in, the more people consider that argument and the risks of leaving. And to anyone who hasn't made up their mind, I would say when you think of the opportunities we want for our children, the place in the world we want for our country, the risks there are to that economy, if you're not decided, don't risk it.
Prime Minister, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
The Prime Minister talking to me earlier here in Cardiff. Well, our political correspondent Michael Crick joins us again now from Westminster. Michael, very interesting because definitely pro-European, pro-Remain, but no passion for Europe.
I know you gave him the opportunity there, John, and he didn't seize it. You remember during the last election, people said there wasn't enough passion in David Cameron, and then he held that meeting, rolled up his sleeves and told everybody, I'm pumped up. And the campaign was a bit different in the general election after David Cameron did that. But he's only got a 7 days now to show a bit more passion in this campaign, because there are a lot of people on the Remain side who think that unless he does so, unless he shows a bit more vision and idealism, then they're in big trouble. Of course, it'd be difficult, on the other hand, to come out and say, I love Brussels.
Now, of course, the thing which, of course, you've been reporting very extensively on, which is, of course, the election expenses scandal, he seems really to be kind of, well, this is mountain out of a molehill stuff, Michael.
He does. He argues that the battle buses that the Conservatives employed last spring in the general election are no different from the battle buses that for years have been taking party leaders around on the campaign trail. But the evidence is that the battle buses, the fleet they used last year, was for taking party volunteers to marginal seats in a centrally organised way. And when they got there, those volunteers were put up in hotels. Most important, that they were working on the ground, giving out literature for individual candidates, going around the doorsteps, reading out scripts, canvassing for individual candidates. And if that's so, then the rules suggest that those expenses should have been declared locally in a way that they weren't. And the Electoral Commission seems to think that as well.
Michael Crick at Westminster.